My name is Oprah Winfrey, and 5 months ago, I learned what it really means to be inconvenient to the people who claim they love you most. After a devastating car crash left me unable to walk, my parents packed their bags, boarded a plane to New Zealand with my sister, and left me behind. No warning, no hesitation, no apology, just a message that said, "Don't call us while we're happy." So I didn't, and in the silence that followed, I stopped pretending we were the kind of family that shows up when it matters. That moment, more than the crash, broke something I'd been protecting for years. Before that, my life felt like it was finally catching up with my effort. I was 37, a senior segment producer at ATL 8 News, a mid-size but rising local news station in Atlanta. I'd worked there for over a decade, climbing the ranks without shortcuts. My days were filled with early meetings, field shoots, last-minute edits, and crisis management when talent didn't show up or stories fell through. I loved the pressure, the adrenaline of live production, and the quiet satisfaction of watching something I built unfold on screen. I had just been promoted to lead producer of our new human interest series, Everyday Light, which spotlighted resilient stories in the community. The irony would hit me later. At home, I was the responsible one, the daughter who sent birthday reminders, who showed up early and left late, who covered car insurance when my sister forgot and filled the freezer when my mom's paycheck came up short. My younger sister, Nina, had always been the free-spirited favorite. She switched majors 3 times in college, traveled through Europe with her sketchbook, and posted inspirational quotes on Instagram over photos of oat milk lattes. My parents adored her. They didn't say it outright, but they didn't have to. They celebrated her chaos as creativity. My structure was treated like background noise. They didn't forget my achievements. They just assumed I didn't need recognition because I was so capable. That's how they explained it. Anyway, "You've always been our rock," my mom used to say, smiling like it was a compliment. I used to believe it was. I didn't realize rock meant someone they expected to stand still while everyone else leaned on her. I didn't notice how often capable meant you'll figure it out on your own. I didn't know that being dependable would eventually make me disposable. The crash happened on a Thursday night. I'd just wrapped an on-location shoot featuring a high school teacher who ran a food bank out of her garage. I was tired, but happy. It was the kind of story I lived for. I remember texting Nina that I could probably swing a few days off next month to attend her graduation dinner. She sent back a heart emoji and a voice note about a big surprise my parents were planning for her. I smiled, not suspecting I wouldn't be part of it. The rain had started while I was driving home through Midtown. I don't remember the impact clearly, just the sound of glass, the violent spin, the weightlessness followed by a crushing stillness. When I opened my eyes, I couldn't feel my legs. I thought I was dreaming until I saw the blood pooling around my hip. They rushed me into surgery with multiple fractures in my pelvis and right femur, internal bruising, and a mild concussion. The doctors told me I'd need at least 3 months of recovery before I could stand on my own, followed by physical therapy, mobility assistance, and supervised in-home care. I asked the nurse if anyone had called my parents. She said they had. Immediately after I was admitted, I waited, thinking they'd show up. That's what parents do, right? Even when you're grown, they come. They show up when you're broken. They came the next evening, more than 24 hours later. Mom walked in with a gift bag from the hospital gift shop. Dad hovered near the door. Nina was on FaceTime, showing me the Airbnb they had just booked near Queenstown. We were just finalizing our travel dates, my mom said, setting the bag down like it was a peace offering. It's been such a crazy week. Are you feeling okay? I nodded, more confused than hurt. They stayed less than an hour. They didn't ask about post-discharge care or how long I'd need help. They didn't ask where I would recover. Instead, they said, "We'll check in before we leave." I assumed they meant for the night. They meant the country. 2 days later, they texted that they were flying out. "Don't call us while we're happy." The message ended, just like that. Not cruel, not sarcastic, just cold. As if my recovery was a nuisance they needed a break from. As if their happiness depended on not hearing from me. It wasn't the words that stunned me. It was the clarity. I had always been the backup plan, the helper, the cheerleader. But the moment I couldn't carry myself, I became dead weight. Coming home was worse than the hospital. My apartment had a staircase to the bedroom, so I set up camp on the couch. A friend from work, Tess, brought groceries and adjusted the cushions to support my back. My parents sent one more message with a link to an online delivery service and a suggestion to focus on the positive. I didn't respond. Nina posted beach photos and boomerangs from mountain trails with captions like "healing vibes only." My name didn't come up once. I lay there the first night with a medical tray by my side, painkillers lined up like soldiers, and an ice pack melting through the towel across my waist. I couldn't sit up on my own, couldn't reach the water bottle, couldn't even cry properly because the pain flared every time I shifted. That's when the anger began, not the loud kind, the quiet, devastating kind that changes how you see people forever. I had told stories about survivors. I had written scripts about betrayal, forgiveness, and redemption. But I had never imagined that mine would start here crippled on a couch, forgotten by the people I'd spent a lifetime supporting. And still, some part of me hoped they would come back, that they'd see what they had done and try to fix it. But they didn't. They went hiking instead, took photos with Nina's diploma in front of waterfalls, wrote captions like "best family trip ever." I stopped checking after the first week. There was nothing left to look for. The truth is, I wasn't angry because they left. I was angry because I had made excuses for them for years. I'd told myself they meant well, that they just didn't know how to show love the way I needed. But the crash didn't create the distance. It revealed it. It was always there, hidden behind duty and holidays and group texts. All the crash did was strip the layers away. And for the first time in my life, I could see them and myself clearly. They left me when I couldn't walk. But someday, I would stand again. And when I did, I wouldn't be waiting for them at the top. The hardest part wasn't the pain. It wasn't the swelling or the weight of the cast pressing into my hip or the way I had to brace myself just to reach for a glass of water. It wasn't even the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling because the painkillers blurred time into a single, groggy haze. The hardest part was the silence, the quiet from the people I thought were my home. The people I'd once believed would sit with me in the dark just so I wouldn't have to be alone in it. But they had gone where the sun was shining, and I had become a shadow they didn't want to carry. Each hour spent alone in that apartment peeled away whatever illusions I still had about unconditional love. Every click of Nina's vacation story, every "so proud of my baby girl" caption from my mother, was a sharp reminder that I had been cut out of the frame before I even had a chance to recover. I tried to keep up appearances, at least in the beginning. I replied to a few emails from work with shaky hands, insisting I'd be ready to return remotely in a few weeks. I sent a text to my boss, Mr. Grayson, thanking him for his kind message and promising to keep him updated. He replied once, then not again. The messages from the office slowed down. The daily check-ins stopped. The world, it seemed, moved on. I didn't blame them. Deadlines don't wait for broken bones, and local TV doesn't stop broadcasting just because someone's life has been paused. Still, it stung. I had helped build that show from the ground up, pitched stories that drew audience tears, mentored interns who now hosted segments I had produced from scratch. I had stayed late, worked holidays, covered for others, never once asked for special treatment. Now, when I needed help the most, the silence was just as loud as it was at home. There were moments when I almost reached out, when the loneliness started to feel less like sadness and more like drowning, when the ache in my legs was second only to the weight in my chest. But then I remembered that text, "Don't call us while we're happy." It echoed every time I hovered over the call button, so I didn't call. Not when I couldn't reach the cabinet where my medication was, not when the microwave beeped at midnight and I couldn't get up to turn it off, not when the swelling returned and I thought something had gone wrong inside the cast. I told myself I was being strong, but deep down, I knew I was just tired of begging to matter. 3 days after they left, the reality of my condition began to settle like dust on everything. I had no ride to my first follow-up appointment. I called ride shares and accessible transport services, but none could guarantee someone would help me in and out of the vehicle. The receptionist at the clinic rescheduled me for 3 weeks later with a tone that barely hid her concern. That same day, a stack of medical bills appeared in my mailbox. Scans, ambulance, surgery, prescriptions, all itemized in cold detail. My emergency savings, which I had set aside to furnish the new condo, would barely cover the copays, let alone home health assistance or daily support. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. My financial plan had always been solid, disciplined. I didn't have debt. I had always believed that being prepared meant being safe, but I had never prepared for being forgotten. I stopped checking social media. I couldn't keep looking at their joy from halfway across the world while I struggled to reach the TV remote. I deleted the apps one by one. I turned off notifications. I set reminders to take my pills. But even those felt like alarms for a life I no longer recognized. The TV played on low volume, more for company than content. The days blurred together in quiet, measured misery. Pain was predictable. Loneliness wasn't. And then, just when I had started to believe that this apartment would become a quiet tomb for my dignity, someone knocked. It wasn't a delivery. It wasn't a neighbor. It was Tess, one of my coworkers. We'd worked on a few pieces together, mostly holiday stories. She was younger than me, bright, observant, the kind of person who didn't speak much, but always caught the details. I opened the door with one hand on my walker, expecting her to smile politely and leave a care package, but she stepped inside, looked around at the state of things, and said nothing. She just moved, set down a tote bag full of groceries, opened the blinds, cleared the clutter around my recovery area like it was second nature. "I didn't want to intrude," she said finally, "but nobody had heard from you, and when someone like you goes silent, something's not right." Her words hit harder than anything I'd heard in weeks, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple and true. I didn't cry. I didn't thank her profusely. I just nodded and let her refill my water, rearrange my meds, and talk about a segment idea she was working on. She didn't offer pity. She didn't pretend this wasn't hard. She just treated me like someone who deserved to be seen. That visit marked a shift. Tess came again the next day, this time with her laptop and some files I needed to review for a rescheduled project. She wasn't doing it for me. She was doing it with me. There's a difference. I didn't feel like a charity case. I felt like a teammate again, like a person with value, not just a patient with limitations. That night, I opened my work email again and responded to a few messages. I didn't promise a return date. I just let people know I was still here. Tess began reaching out to others quietly. Within days, my inbox filled with short, practical offers. Someone from accounting offered to help set up a payment plan. A junior editor volunteered to drop off food from the cafeteria. Mr. Grayson even emailed again, apologizing for the gap in communication and offering to set up a flexible remote option whenever I felt ready. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And that's what I held on to, not the betrayal, not the silence, but the people who showed up without being asked, the ones who didn't post their kindness but delivered it in person. One act at a time, the people who reminded me that family isn't always built from shared blood. Sometimes it's built from shared burdens. I wasn't ready to forgive my parents. I wasn't even ready to talk to them. But for the first time since the crash, I looked around and thought, maybe I wouldn't have to do this alone after all. Maybe survival didn't mean proving I didn't need anyone. Maybe it just meant learning who was actually worth needing. Recovery is rarely dramatic. It doesn't happen in one glorious moment of triumph. It happens in silence, in hours that drag like years, in pain that moves from sharp to dull to background noise, and in moments when standing for 10 seconds feels like climbing a mountain after Tess stepped in. My days took on a new rhythm, not easy, but less chaotic. I began to sense the difference between being alone and being abandoned. One you can survive, the other takes pieces of you. Tess brought with her a quiet kind of steadiness, like she knew how close I was to slipping and didn't want to scare me into hiding. She never asked for details. She never pushed me to explain why my family was absent. She just kept showing up, like someone who understood that presence doesn't need permission. Around week 3, something shifted. I stopped reacting to every mention of my parents with heat behind my ribs. The anger didn't disappear, but it no longer ruled the room. I had started physical therapy, guided virtually by a soft-spoken woman named Angela, who sent videos, diagrams, and voice notes full of encouragement. At first, I couldn't even do the basic stretches without wincing, but Angela celebrated small victories like they were championships. 5 seconds of weight-bearing, 1 full rotation of the ankle. The first time I stood up with a walker and didn't feel dizzy. I cried, not because it hurt, but because it felt like a decision, like my body had agreed to try again. Work was still distant, but not gone. Mr. Grayson emailed to ask if I'd be open to reviewing a few scripts as a consultant. He framed it as optional, only if you're up for it. But I saw through it. It was his way of keeping me in the loop without making me feel like a liability. I said yes. I missed having my name on something. I missed being part of a process. So I read the scripts. I offered feedback. It was a small return, but it lit a part of me I thought had gone out in the crash. What I didn't expect was how word of my condition had spread, not through gossip, but through quiet respect. The interns I'd trained sent notes checking in. A freelance videographer offered to install a grab bar in my bathroom. Janet, one of our senior editors, stopped by with her wife, Michael, a nurse who gently examined my surgical sites and explained what to watch for. "You're healing well," she said, adjusting the bandages. "You're tougher than most of my patients." I didn't feel tough, but I nodded anyway. One afternoon, while trying to return a few missed calls, I came across a voicemail I hadn't heard. It was from Nina. Her voice was low, hesitant. "Hey, I know you're probably upset. I didn't know how to say no to them. I wanted to stay, but Mom said it would ruin the trip. I'm sorry. I really am. I hope you're okay. I don't know what else to say." The message ended abruptly. I stared at the screen for a long time. There was no apology for going, just regret that she hadn't fought harder to stay. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Still, I didn't call back. Some gaps needed to be felt before they could be crossed. Meanwhile, something else began to form. A project. I hadn't planned it, but it grew naturally from the hours I spent reading about injury, isolation, and family estrangement. I started collecting stories, first my own, then through conversations with others who reached out after hearing what happened. People who had been left behind by the ones they trusted most. People who didn't make the inspirational cut for the segments I used to produce. Their pain wasn't dramatic or camera-ready. It was ordinary, quiet, and real. And I thought, maybe this is the story I need to tell now, not as a comeback, not for attention, but as proof that survival isn't just about walking again. It's about seeing yourself clearly when everyone else chooses to look away. I drafted the pitch on a Tuesday night. Second Chair was the working title, a digital storytelling series focused on people who weren't the first choice, the overlooked siblings, the passed-over workers, the caretakers who were never cared for, the ones who sat quietly beside the spotlight and still kept clapping. I didn't know if anyone would greenlight it, but it felt honest. It felt like something I would watch if I weren't me. I sent it to Mr. Grayson with no expectations. His reply came less than 2 hours later. This is bold, raw, let's talk. At the same time, I was growing stronger physically. My steps were slow, sometimes shaky, but they were mine. Tess began documenting my progress, not for content, but for me. Short clips of me practicing stairs, cooking a simple meal, getting out of bed without assistance. I didn't realize how important those clips would become until I watched them back one day and saw, not a broken woman, but a determined one, someone who had been cut out of the frame and decided to make her own. Then came the article. It was written by a local freelancer, Cooper Miles, who had interviewed me months ago for a different segment. He had heard about my crash and reached out to Tess. I agreed to speak with him, not to name names, not to lash out, but to talk about what abandonment during recovery feels like when it comes from your own blood. The piece was called Left Behind, When Family Walks Away. It went viral, quietly. It wasn't trending or dramatic, but it struck a nerve. Comments poured in, private messages followed. Not pity, not sympathy, recognition, the kind that comes from shared pain. I wasn't looking for revenge, but the truth had a strange way of doing its own work. People I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. Colleagues started treating me differently, not with awkward caution, but with deeper respect. The project got traction. Cooper's article opened doors. Suddenly, I wasn't just the producer who had disappeared after an accident. I was the one who was building something from it. The shift was subtle, but I felt it. And then one morning, while eating eggs and watching my inbox, I saw a notification from Nina, not a voicemail, a message. I saw the article. I read every word. I don't know how to undo what we did, but if you'll let me, I want to show up, not to fix it, just to be there. I stared at it for a long time, unsure if I was ready to let her back in, but part of me knew. The fact that she saw herself in what I wrote meant something had landed. The comeback wasn't finished. I hadn't fully healed, but the weight had shifted. I was no longer crawling out of a pit. I was building something solid, one truth at a time. When you're betrayed by the people closest to you, the healing doesn't just happen in your body. It happens in the way you speak your own name without shame. It happens the first time you walk into a room and no longer brace yourself for silence. It happens when you stop explaining your worth to those who left and start building spaces where you no longer need their approval to exist. That was the space I found myself in As week 5 turned into week 6, I wasn't angry anymore, at least not the kind that eats you alive. I was building, one small, deliberate brick at a time, and the structure I was creating looked nothing like the one I had been cast out of. Mr. Grayson had scheduled a video meeting to talk about second chair. I expected a polite conversation, maybe a few gentle rejections wrapped in corporate language. What I got was the opposite. He didn't just want the project, he wanted it on the fall schedule. He said something about the network wanting more raw, real human stories, and less shiny feel-good fluff. For a moment, I couldn't respond. I sat there, staring at the screen, aware that my walker was still within arm's reach, that my legs still ached from the therapy session I'd pushed through that morning. But suddenly none of that mattered. I wasn't just being welcomed back. I was being asked to lead something that mattered, something I had birthed from pain, not in spite of it. Tess would be my co-producer. She didn't say much during the call, but when it ended, she looked at me and said, "They're going to follow your lead now. Just make sure you take them somewhere that looks like truth." I wrote that line down after she left. I taped it above my computer. It became the quiet compass in the weeks that followed. Scripts were developed, pilot interviews scheduled. People started reaching out, strangers who had read the article, who had seen the call for stories, who were ready to talk about what it feels like to be the person left behind. The stories weren't glamorous. A man whose mother disowned him for not taking over the family business. A nurse who cared for her siblings only to be cut off when she got sick. A retired teacher whose grown children stopped visiting when she stopped giving money. The stories had a common theme, not hatred, not cruelty, but the absence of care wrapped in the language of obligation. It was betrayal without shouting. It was neglect disguised as peace. The work gave my days shape, but more than that, it gave me purpose, real purpose, not the kind you perform at meetings or put in resumes, but the kind that lets you sleep at night, knowing you've taken your own pain and done something with it. My legs still hurt. I still had days when climbing the stairs felt like too much, but I was moving forward, even if slowly, and in that movement, something inside me solidified. I no longer needed the people who had left me, not because I didn't love them, but because I had learned how to love myself louder than their silence. Then came the call that shifted everything again. It was from a producer at a larger regional network. They'd seen Cooper's article, heard about the second chair pitch, and wanted to discuss partnership, distribution, sponsorship, possibly even turning the concept into a recurring docuseries. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't come often. It was big, but it also came with conditions. "Would you be willing?" the producer asked. "To feature your story as the lead episode." I paused, not because I wasn't willing, but because I had never considered turning the camera back on myself. I had told my story in pieces, in controlled fragments, but this was different. This meant showing the whole thing, the text, the silence, the truth of being left in a chair while your family posed for sunset photos on the other side of the world. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the lights low and the windows open. I thought about my mother's voice telling me not to call. I thought about Nina's voicemail, soft and full of regret. I thought about the sound of the door closing that first night they left, and I realized something. I wasn't ashamed anymore. I wasn't afraid that people would pity me. I wasn't afraid of what my family would say if I spoke openly. I had lived through their silence. I had survived their absence. What else could they take now? I said yes. The production process was intimate. I worked with Cooper to shape the episode. He asked gentle questions, and I gave real answers. No dramatics, no edits for comfort. Just the truth, the crash, the hospital, the message, the aftermath, and more importantly, the climb out of it. We filmed pieces in my apartment, at the physical therapy center, at the newsroom where the new project was taking shape. No one cried on camera. No one raised their voice. It wasn't a story of rage. It was a story of refusal, refusing to be erased, refusing to be bitter, refusing to stay small. 2 days before the episode was scheduled to air online, I got a message, this time. It wasn't from Nina. It was from my mother. It was short. We saw the article. Your father and I didn't realize how badly it hurt you. We thought you'd bounce back. You always did. I don't know what to say. I hope you're doing better. I didn't reply, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I no longer needed her acknowledgement to validate my pain. I read the message twice. Then I deleted it, not in anger, in peace. When the episode aired, it didn't go viral in a loud way, but it traveled. It reached inboxes. It was shared in support groups. It was played on laptops in hospital rooms. It was quoted in newsletters and referenced in interviews. And slowly, my inbox filled again, not with apologies, not with empty praise, with resonance. People said, "This is my story too." They said, "You said what I couldn't find the words for." They said, "Thank you." And one message simply read, "I thought I was alone." That was when I knew we had done something right. We hadn't exposed a scandal. We hadn't named villains. We had told the truth in a world built on pretending, and truth, when told quietly but clearly, always finds its way home. I wasn't fully healed. My body still had limits, but something stronger than muscle had returned. I had momentum. I had voice. I had community. And I had finally realized that the people who left me were not the ending. They were just the silence before the real story began. I used to think closure came with confrontation, that there would be a moment when the people who hurt me would stand in front of me, admit what they did, and apologize. I waited for it without realizing I had already moved past needing it. The day my parents returned from New Zealand was uneventful in every practical sense. There was no dramatic knock on my door, no surprise hug in the middle of my living room. Instead, it started with a text from my mother. "We're back in town. We'll stop by tomorrow to check on you." No question mark. No asking if I wanted to see them. Just an assumption that they could step back in and resume where they had left off. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The version of me they abandoned no longer lived in that apartment. The next afternoon, they arrived unannounced. I was in the middle of reviewing edits with Tess and Janet, both of whom were sitting at my dining table, laptops open, storyboards pinned to the wall. Angela, my therapist, had just finished helping me with mobility drills and was packing up her supplies. When the door opened and my parents walked in with Nina trailing behind, the entire room seemed to pause. They looked surprised, like they'd expected to find me alone, defeated, maybe still in bed with a throw blanket and a dull expression. What they saw instead was a room alive with work, voices, and a kind of movement that had nothing to do with physical strength. Their eyes scanned the space. Unsure of where to land, it was Dad who spoke first. "Well, looks like you've been busy." Busy, as if I had spent the past 2 months redecorating. I nodded once, kept my voice steady. "We're wrapping up edits for a segment." I didn't explain what it was. I didn't invite them in. Janet glanced at me, reading the tension, then gathered her things. Tess followed. Angela paused by the door. "Text me if you want to push tomorrow's session," she said gently. I nodded, grateful for her timing. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed wasn't painful. It was purposeful. I looked at the people who once called themselves my biggest supporters and didn't feel smaller. I felt centered. Mom set down a gift bag with souvenirs tea, a scarf, some handmade necklace. "We thought of you," she said. I took the bag, thanked her, polite, civil, detached. Dad asked how I was healing. I told him I had started walking again, that physical therapy was progressing, that I had resumed working. He seemed caught off guard, like he'd expected to hear about delays, complications, setbacks. Nina didn't speak at all. She looked uncomfortable, like someone who wanted to say something but didn't know how to begin. I didn't rescue her from the silence. Then my mother said the one thing I had expected. "Well, we're back now. You don't have to do all this alone anymore." I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment. Then I said, calmly and without any heat, "You already taught me how to do it alone." Her face stiffened. Dad looked down at his shoes. Nina glanced between us but still said nothing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply spoke what had lived in my chest for too long. "You chose to leave. You chose to go on vacation while I couldn't stand, while I couldn't bathe or cook or even make it to a doctor's appointment. I asked for help. You told me not to call." "We didn't mean it like that," Mom said quickly. "The kind of defensiveness that comes from being caught, not from regret. We thought you were fine. You're always so strong." "That's the problem," I replied. "You mistook silence for strength. You saw independence as immunity, but I wasn't fine, and you weren't there." They tried to explain logistics, non-refundable deposits, plans made long in advance. Dad said something about not realizing how serious the recovery would be. Mom tried to paint the trip as something for Nina, something she had earned. I let them talk. I listened. And then, when they finished, I said, "I'm not angry anymore, but I am changed. And this, whatever this is, won't go back to what it was before." That was the first moment Nina spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear. "She's right," she said, turning toward our parents. "We left her. I knew it was wrong. I should have stayed. I just didn't know how to fight you." The room shifted. My parents looked stunned, like the idea of being confronted by their second daughter had never occurred to them. Mom turned toward Nina, eyes wide. "After everything we've done for you." "It's not about what you've done," Nina interrupted, still soft but firm. "It's about what you didn't do when it mattered." For the first time, I saw her not as the carefree favorite, but as someone who had also been shaped by expectations she didn't choose. Maybe we had more in common than I realized. Maybe we had both been taught that love looked like obedience. The visit didn't end with hugs. It ended with boundaries. I told them I was open to occasional contact, but that trust would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. I wasn't closing the door. I was changing the lock. They left quietly. No promises, no declarations, just an awkward wave and a closed door behind them. Nina stayed behind. She helped me clean up the workspace, asked if I wanted tea. We sat in silence for a few minutes before she spoke again. "I've been thinking about moving out, getting my own place, somewhere near here, away from them." I nodded. I didn't tell her what to do. I didn't offer advice. I just said, "Let me know if you need help." And for once, help felt like a choice, not a duty. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. No dreams, no tossing, just rest. I had confronted the people who broke me and didn't let it undo my recovery. I had stood in the space they tried to vacate and made it my own, and in the quiet that followed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief, not from pain, but from pretending. It's strange how healing doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like drinking your coffee without checking your phone for validation. Sometimes it's sitting across from someone who once hurt you and realizing their words no longer carry weight. Other times, it's simply waking up and not feeling that tight knot of dread in your chest. That's where I found myself 2 months after the crash, no longer fighting to survive, but learning how to live differently, not louder, just clearer. The episode of Second Chair featuring my story had aired the week before. The response was steady, not explosive, and that was exactly what I hoped for. People didn't repost it with dramatic captions or fire emojis. They wrote long emails, private messages, direct notes with sentences that started with, "I've never told anyone this," but, and ended with, "Thank you for saying it first." That was all I wanted. Not fame, not applause, just resonance. My team at ATL8 had changed, but not in the way I feared. I wasn't treated as fragile or exceptional. I was treated as essential. Mr. Grayson pulled me aside after our weekly content meeting and said, "You didn't just come back. You came back clearer. That matters." Tess had grown into more than a co-producer. She had become a creative equal, someone who challenged me, sharpened my vision, but always made space for my story. Angela, my physical therapist, had shifted her sessions from mere rehabilitation to a kind of rebuilding of self, our conversations often drifting into things beyond muscle and bone. She once said, "You're learning how to walk with more than just your legs." And she was right. One Friday afternoon, as we were finalizing the 3rd episode of the series, Nina stopped by, not unannounced, not by accident, but with intention. She brought a folder with housing listings circled in red, apartments within walking distance of mine. "I found 2 I like," she said simply, "not ready to sign yet, but I wanted you to see them." We sat at my dining table, which had once doubled as my recovery station, now covered in laptops, documents, and storyboards. We flipped through photos of small studios and 1-bedrooms, places that weren't flashy, but offered something we both knew she hadn't had before: autonomy. As we talked, she admitted things I had suspected but never heard out loud, that she had always known I carried more weight, that our parents rewarded her compliance while punishing my independence by ignoring it, that she felt guilty, not just about leaving during my crash, but for the years before, when she let their favoritism go unchallenged. I didn't rush to forgive her, but I didn't push her away either. We were, for the first time, building something real, and like anything real, it came slowly, carefully, with truth laid down like bricks, one honest sentence at a time. That night, we had dinner at the same spot where my team had celebrated my promotion months before the crash. The manager recognized me, asked how I was doing. I said I was walking again, quietly. Nina smiled across the table. "No one would believe you ever stopped." But I had. The thing was, it didn't define me anymore. Around this time, I received an invitation to speak at a regional journalism conference. The keynote speaker had backed out, and someone from the board had seen my work with Second Chair. They asked if I would be willing to share my story, not just the personal part, but how I had turned personal pain into professional purpose. I hesitated, not because I didn't know what to say, but because for the first time, I realized the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every person who had been overlooked, sidelined, told to be strong when what they really needed was to be held. But I accepted, not to be the face of anything, just to be one voice among many. The day of the conference arrived, and I stood backstage watching speakers take their turns. Some talked about AI in newsrooms, others about ethics in field reporting. When it was my time, I stepped up to the podium not with perfect posture, not without discomfort, but with a steadiness I hadn't known I possessed until I needed it. I opened with a sentence I had carried in my chest since that hospital bed. I used to think my job was to tell other people's stories. I didn't realize I had been avoiding my own. The room was silent, not in tension, but in attention. I told them about the crash, the abandonment, the silence that followed. And then I told them about the knock on my door, about Tess, about the team that rebuilt something more valuable than pity dignity. When I finished, there was no standing ovation, just quiet, sincere applause. I walked off stage not to validation, but to conversations. People came up afterward, not to congratulate me, but to connect. A producer from Dallas said his brother had experienced something similar after a work injury. A college professor said she planned to use the episode in her ethics class. A young woman whispered that she had never heard someone say aloud what it felt like to be forgotten by the very people who raised you. Weeks passed. The series grew, not viral, not fast, but steadily, like roots taking hold underground. People sent in their own stories. We curated them, one by one, with care, and one morning, as I was reviewing a rough cut, I received a letter in the mail, not a message, not an email, a letter from my father. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, structured, like him. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He wrote that he had watched the episode alone, without telling my mother. He said he hadn't realized, truly, what they had done until he saw the emptiness of those first weeks reflected in my voice. He didn't apologize in the traditional way. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but he said, if I had to do it over again, I would have stayed. And that's the truth I have to live with now. I folded the letter, put it in a drawer not to forget, but to remember. Not all wrongs are righted. Some just have to be carried with you in a way that makes you better, not bitter. By now, I was walking unassisted. Stairs were still hard, and rainy days made my joints ache. But I moved through the world differently. Not faster, not stronger, just freer. And sometimes, when I passed the mirror and caught a glimpse of the scar down my leg, I didn't wince. I nodded, because I had survived, not just the crash, but the choice someone else made to walk away when I needed them most. And I had chosen to stay, with myself, with my story, with the people who showed up. 6 months after the crash, I stood in front of a full studio with a mic clipped to my shirt and a script in hand, not someone else's words, mine. I wasn't behind the camera or behind the scenes this time. I was center frame, speaking into the lens, not to perform, but to document what it really looks like when someone refuses to stay erased. The episode we were shooting wasn't about my accident. It wasn't about abandonment. It was about recovery, quiet, persistent, earned recovery. The kind that comes not from revenge, not from proving anyone wrong, but from doing the work it takes to make your voice louder than their silence. This wasn't a comeback. This was a beginning on my own terms. The Second Chair project had expanded into something bigger than I planned, not just a series, but a growing archive of real human voices, people who had survived emotional betrayal, toxic family systems, workplace exclusion, and subtle cruelty disguised as love. It didn't go viral. It didn't need to. It landed where it was meant to land, with people who had been quietly waiting to be seen. I read every message that came in. Some were angry, some were grateful, some were scared, but they all had one thing in common, a sense of recognition. One woman wrote, I always thought I was crazy for feeling abandoned. I didn't have a dramatic story. My parents just weren't there. Thank you for making that real. And in those moments, I realized this work wasn't just storytelling. It was truth-telling. It was community building through shared clarity. Professionally, things were changing. People who once overlooked my pitches now asked for my input. The stories I used to struggle to get greenlit were now the center of team meetings. I didn't need to raise my voice anymore to be heard. I had earned stillness. I had earned calm. At ATL 8, we launched a partnership with a local nonprofit to host storytelling workshops for survivors of medical trauma and family estrangement. I led the first session. I told them, "You don't have to make it dramatic to make it matter. You just have to make it true." That line made its way onto a poster the interns designed. I didn't plan that, but when I saw it taped to the office wall, I didn't object. One morning, while grabbing coffee from the corner shop near the station, I saw my mother. She was standing in line, holding a magazine, her expression focused but not tense. She hadn't seen me yet, for a second. I considered turning around, avoiding the scene, choosing ease over impact, but I didn't. I stepped forward. She looked up, for the first time in our long history. She didn't try to pretend. "Oprah," she said softly, like the name itself carried weight now. I nodded. We stood there in silence for a moment before she added, "Your series. I watched some of it. You're doing something real." I thanked her, not with enthusiasm, not with sarcasm, just enough to acknowledge the sentence. She didn't apologize, not directly, but as we stepped outside together. She said something I wasn't prepared for. "When your father and I left, I told myself you'd be fine because you always were. I think I confused your silence with strength." I didn't correct her. I didn't explain that silence was survival, not strength. She needed to come to that understanding on her own, so I just said, "I'm not silent anymore." She nodded. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. She handed me the coffee she had paid for and said, "Maybe one day you'll let me help with something." I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. Later that week, I received an invitation to a local award ceremony. It was a small community recognition event. They were honoring media contributors who had impacted social discourse. Tess had submitted our work without telling me. When I found out, I rolled my eyes, but part of me smiled. I didn't go for the recognition. I went because I wanted to see who else would be in the room. And when they called my name and handed me the small glass plaque, I didn't talk about the crash. I didn't talk about being left behind. I said, "We don't get to choose what breaks us, but we get to choose what we build from it." And this. I held up the plaque without fanfare. This isn't about the project. It's about the choice to keep building. After the event, I walked home without assistance. No walker, no cane. My gait wasn't perfect, and stairs still made me cautious. But I moved forward without pause. At home, I opened my laptop to check edits on the latest episode. Nina's name popped up on my screen. She had sent me a link. I clicked it. It was a blog post, her first, titled, "When You Realize You Were the Favorite for All the Wrong Reasons." She had written about our family, not blaming them, just unpacking the ways she had been protected, then controlled, how she had watched me carry burdens while being told I was too serious, how she hadn't known how to speak up because being the favorite meant being quiet. I read every word twice. Then I called her. "You ready to tell this on camera?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Only if you'll sit beside me." And that's exactly what we did. The final episode of the season featured both of us. It wasn't about blame. It was about reckoning. Two sisters, raised in the same house, finally telling the truth. Neither of them had the words for growing up. We didn't resolve everything. We didn't pretend the past hadn't left bruises, but we looked each other in the eye and said, "We're not letting this keep us small," and that was enough. In the last scene of the episode, we sat on my couch, the same one I had once been confined to, wrapped in blankets and silence. Now, it was just a seat, a place to rest, not hide. Nina turned to me and said, "You've always been strong, but now you don't have to be alone to prove it." I didn't reply. I just reached over and held her hand. For once, nothing needed to be said. That night, as I uploaded the final cut and watched the progress bar crawl to completion, I realized something simple and quiet. I hadn't gotten revenge. I hadn't gotten closure. I had gotten something better. I had found my voice, and once you find it, no one gets to take it from you again. The first time someone introduced me at an event as Oprah Winfrey, founder of Second Chair, I almost corrected them for most of my career. I was the one behind the scenes, the one lining up other people's voices, stitching together their courage and clarity. Hearing my name linked to a platform that had started in a dark living room with me half paralyzed and ignored felt surreal, but I didn't interrupt. I just smiled and accepted it, because I knew what it cost to get here, not just the physical healing, but the reckoning, the stripping away of roles I had never consented to play, the letting go of needing to be the strong one in a family that only noticed you when you were useful. That cost me everything I thought I knew about belonging. But what I got in return was ownership of my voice, of my narrative, of the community that formed not because I was perfect, but because I dared to say what so many kept buried. As the months passed, Second Chair gained quiet momentum, not because it was shocking or controversial, but because it was honest. The episodes weren't filled with viral drama or high-definition heartbreak. They were filled with stillness, with people telling the truth without performance, and in a world that rewards noise. We chose depth. We told the story of a man who was pushed out of his family business after recovering from cancer because he could no longer carry his weight, of a woman who raised her 3 siblings and was later left out of all family decisions, of an autistic teenager whose parents insisted on speaking for him in public but never listened to him at home. These weren't headline stories, but they were human ones, and that was enough. What started as a personal act of survival had evolved into a collective act of dignity. We held space for what I called emotional orphanhood, the quiet grief of being physically close to people who emotionally abandoned you. It resonated. Therapists reached out. Educators used our episodes in classrooms. Social workers said it helped them understand what paperwork couldn't show. We never asked people to forgive those who hurt them. We asked them to tell the truth, because healing begins when silence ends. One of the turning points came when a national journalist requested an interview not just about the project, but about my story. This wasn't Cooper, who had handled my words with nuance and care. This was a glossy outlet, big platform, high traffic. They wanted details, the ones I had deliberately left soft-edged. Can we include direct quotes from the message your mother sent you? The "don't call us while we're happy" line? I paused. That sentence had become the emotional hook of the first episode. It was the wound that started it all. But I wasn't sure I wanted it to define me forever. "No," I said calmly. "You can mention the message, but you don't get to turn it into a slogan. That was my low point, and my low point doesn't belong to your headline." There was a pause on the other end of the call, then a surprised, "Understood." That was when I realized I had fully stepped into authorship, not just of my content, but of my boundaries. I wasn't here to be used. I was here to lead. Nina continued growing into her own voice as well. Her blog reached a small but engaged audience. She began writing pieces about the unseen dynamics in families that reward one child's obedience at the cost of another's clarity. She didn't write to attack. She wrote to process, to own. and when she was invited to speak on a panel for adult children navigating family estrangement. She asked me to sit in the front row. I did, quietly, proudly. She told a story about being the favorite but never feeling free, and afterward, as people thanked her, I realized that breaking generational patterns isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just two sisters learning how to say, "I'm here," even when it's hard. One afternoon, I received a call from my old HR director, the same one who had once warned that my prolonged absence might jeopardize my job. She was warm, apologetic, asking if I'd be open to consulting on their new wellness program. They were looking to create better resources for employees recovering from trauma. I didn't say yes right away, but I also didn't hang up. That's growth, I think. Not needing to hold on to old pain just to prove it happened. Letting it live, quietly, and still choosing how much access others get to the healed version of you. The apartment that once felt like a cage now felt like a studio. Not a TV studio, a life studio, a place where things got created, stories, meals, connections. Some days I still had flare-ups of pain. The leg would tighten, the stairs would fight back. But I didn't curse it. My body wasn't a reminder of what I lost. It was a receipt of what I earned. On the wall above my workspace was a photo. Tess took the day we wrapped the first season of Second Chair. It wasn't staged. I wasn't posed. I was sitting in my chair, headphones around my neck, eyes tired, but posture steady, behind me. The whole team was blurry in the background, collaborators, friends, co-creators, no blood relatives in sight. But somehow, it felt more like family than any holiday dinner I'd ever been to. And one evening, when the sun was pouring through the windows and Nina had fallen asleep on the couch after one of our edit sessions, I thought about how much had changed, not in the dramatic sense, but in the grounded, daily sense, the kind of change you only notice when you look back and realize you've stopped bracing for the worst, that the apology you never got doesn't sting anymore, that you no longer need closure because you've outgrown the door. I picked up my phone and opened the voice recorder. I didn't know why. I just felt the need to capture something, not for the show, not for an audience, but for myself. I hit record and said, "They left when I couldn't walk, but I didn't wait for them to carry me back. I built the road on my own, and now I'm walking it, every day." Then I stopped recording. I didn't play it back. I didn't share it. I just let it sit. Because some stories don't need to be published to be powerful. They just need to be lived. There's a quiet kind of pride that settles in when you no longer need to explain your survival. It's not loud or performative. It doesn't need witnesses or applause. It simply exists, like the way your breath evens out after years of holding it. That's where I found myself as the second season of Second Chair moved into development. This wasn't a comeback. This was continuity, a life no longer built around proving myself to people who never truly saw me. The difference was subtle but permanent. I was no longer living in reaction to what they did. I was living in alignment with what I knew to be true. The station gave us more room physically and editorially. What started as a side project was now a headline initiative. We had our own segment, our own editors, even a rotating panel of guest contributors. The stories we chose to tell didn't follow trends. We didn't chase virality. We stayed in the quiet lane, a former foster youth who became a social worker, a woman who spent 10 years rebuilding after her parents abandoned her during a divorce, a son who forgave his mother's silence but not her refusal to change. The comment section was never explosive, but the inbox always full. People said things like, "This helped me understand my mother better," or, "Now I know I'm not overreacting." That was our metric of success, not views, resonance. One afternoon, Tess pulled me aside. "I've been thinking," she said. "Have you considered taking this to print?" "A book maybe," I blinked. Writing a book had never crossed my mind. Not because I didn't have words, but because I never imagined packaging my pain into something that might sit on someone's coffee table. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Not as a memoir, but as a collection of quiet truths, reflections on survival, dignity, and the cost of being the strong one. I started writing in the mornings. Nothing structured, just memory fragments and emotional blueprints. It wasn't therapy. It was architecture. I was building something, one sentence at a time. Around the same time, Nina's blog picked up traction. She started getting interview requests. At first, she declined. Then one day she said, "Maybe if we do one together." We chose a small, independent podcast hosted by a woman who specialized in sibling dynamics. During the recording, I expected to carry the weight of the conversation like I always had, but halfway through, Nina surprised me. She spoke not as the passive sibling who watched from the sidelines, but as someone who had finally found her spine. "I used to think being the favorite meant I had it easier," she said, "but now I know it just meant I didn't know how to say no." There was a long pause after that. The host let it breathe. I reached for her hand and just said, "You're not alone anymore." The interview made its way through online forums, communities, support groups. People reached out not just to me, but to Nina. She was finally seen, not as my echo, but as her own voice. We grew closer in ways I never expected. She became part of the production team in a small but steady capacity, helping vet stories, draft emotional arcs, even offer feedback from a perspective I had grown too close to see clearly. She never tried to center herself. She just showed up, consistently, quietly, the way I once wished our parents had. Speaking of them, the distance between us remained. But it was no longer charged with grief. It was neutral. I had chosen my boundaries. They had chosen their silence. Once in a while, a birthday card would arrive. No calls, no long letters, just signatures. Sometimes Nina would ask if I planned to visit. I'd say no, not out of spite, out of clarity. Some wounds don't bleed anymore, but they don't forget. I didn't need to reopen them to prove I had healed. Then one morning, I got an email. It was from a university, an invitation to speak at a symposium on narrative and trauma. I was being asked to sit on a panel alongside authors, psychologists, and filmmakers. The topic, how storytelling helps people reclaim agency after betrayal. I stared at the screen for a long time. I had spent so many years being the invisible one, the left behind one. Now I was being asked to speak about rebuilding, about truth, about choosing not to vanish. At the symposium, I was the only one on the panel without a PhD or film credits. But when I spoke, the room held still, not out of awe, but out of identification. I talked about the day I sat in my living room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how to call for help when the people who should have helped had chosen joy over presence. I told them I didn't write out of vengeance. I wrote because silence had taken too much already. And afterward, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. Not dramatic ones, just the kind that form when you finally hear yourself in someone else's story, she said. I thought healing had to be loud, but now I see it can be steady too. I thanked her. She wasn't just hearing me. She was seeing herself. When I returned home, I found the old journal I had used during my recovery. It was full of fragments, scribbled quotes, pain logs, therapy notes. At the bottom of one page was a line I didn't remember writing. It read, "They left when I broke, but I didn't stay broken. I stared at it for a long time. Then I tore the page out and pinned it above my desk." Second Chair was preparing to close its second season. We were planning a small community event, not a gala, just a gathering, former guests, supporters, audience members who had reached out. We rented a modest space, ordered sandwiches, set up a projector. That night, people cried, but not from sadness, from relief, from connection. Someone stood up during the open mic and said, "You made it okay for us to say. They hurt me, and I still hope they change, but I'm moving forward whether they do or not." Everyone clapped. No spotlight, no stage, just chairs, all on the same level. And as I looked out across the room at Nina near the door greeting guests, at Tess checking cables, at Cooper in the corner writing notes, I felt it. Not triumph, not closure, something better. Peace, real peace. The kind that doesn't require revenge, just honesty, direction, and the decision to no longer wait for people to value what you already know has worth. I never imagined the most profound moment of this entire journey would take place not in front of a camera or behind a microphone, but in the quiet of a hospital hallway. It was the same hospital where they'd wheeled me in months ago, where I had first opened my eyes to discover not only the weight of broken bones, but the weight of being forgotten. I was there again, not as a patient, but as a visitor. Nina had called me in the middle of the night. Our father had suffered a minor stroke. He was stable, alert, recovering, but shaken, and for reasons she didn't fully explain. She asked me to come. I said yes without overthinking it, not because I owed them anything, but because I owed myself the clarity of standing in that place again. This time, not broken. When I arrived, the waiting room smelled like bleach and overripe fruit. Nina was sitting in the corner chair, fidgeting with a vending machine coffee. She looked up and gave me a small smile. "He's awake. Mom's inside." I nodded, hung my coat, and stood by the door. I had no script for what would happen next. I wasn't here for reconciliation. I was here for truth. When I stepped inside the room, my mother was sitting beside the bed, holding Dad's hand like she was bracing against a tide. She saw me, startled for a second, then looked down. Dad turned his head slowly. His face looked older than I remembered, not just aged, but softened. "Oprah," he said quietly, like the sound of my name held a history neither of us had the strength to unpack. I walked closer but didn't sit. "You came." I didn't respond to that. Instead, I asked how he was feeling. He shrugged slightly, slower, but alive. Then there was silence. My mother shifted uncomfortably, then stood. "I'll give you two a moment," she said, brushing past me without a second glance. It was just him and me now, no one else to translate, excuse, or soften the space between us. "I've watched your show," he said after a long pause. "I see what you're doing. It's important." He looked tired, not just from illness, but from something deeper. I waited. Then he added, "I wish I had handled things differently, after the crash, before it too. Probably. We didn't know how to be there without trying to fix everything, and when we couldn't fix it, we left. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't nothing." I studied his face. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel pity. I felt distance, a truth between us that didn't need to be bridged. It only needed to be acknowledged. "You don't need to say more," I replied evenly. "I'm not here for that. I'm here because Nina asked, and because I wanted to see for myself that you were okay." He nodded, eyes misting, but no tears fell. "You've done well," he said, "not in spite of us, but without us. I see that now." I thanked him, calmly, No crescendo, just two people accepting the version of each other that reality allowed. When I left the room, Nina looked at me with a question in her eyes. "You good?" she asked. I nodded. Better than I expected. She took my arm as we walked toward the elevator. "You didn't have to come, but I'm glad you did." I squeezed her hand. "I came for me, and I'm leaving whole." That night, as I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker like small stories in motion, I thought back to the moment I first heard that voicemail. "Don't call us while we're happy." I remembered how those words had crushed me, not just because they were cruel, but because they proved what I had always feared, that my pain was an inconvenience in their pursuit of peace. But now, all these months later, those words didn't echo, they didn't sting. They simply sat where they belonged in the past. The beauty of betrayal stories isn't in the revenge, it's in the reclamation, in the way you slowly gather the parts of yourself that were scattered, silenced, or shamed, and you build something stronger, not because you were broken, but because you were unfinished. My story wasn't about punishment. It was about permission. The permission to stop performing, to stop waiting for people to become who I needed them to be, and to become that person for myself. The final episode of our second season aired the following week. It ended not with a dramatic reveal or a closing monologue, but with a still shot of our editing room, lights low, Nina and I reviewing stories, surrounded by soundboards and mugs of tea, a quiet space, a held space, a space that had become, for us and for so many others, a second home. When the screen faded to black, the words appeared. Some stories don't need an ending, just a place to keep going. That was the line I chose to close the season. It wasn't SEO friendly, it wasn't quotable, but it was true. Months later, I'd be asked again by another outlet, another conference, what advice I had for people who feel erased by their own family. And every time, I'd give the same answer, not rehearsed, but lived. Start where it hurts. Speak where it's quiet. And remember, the people who walked away didn't take your worth with them. They left it behind. Go pick it up. That, more than any production credit or recognition, is what I carry forward. That moment in the dark when no one came, and I reached for my own voice and found it. Because in the end, it wasn't just about walking again. It was about standing up for something deeper than recovery. It was about choosing a life that honors the truth. And that truth is simple. They left. I stayed. And in staying, I became more than they ever allowed me to be.